Welcome, I'm Brian Kay, and today we are exploring a bit about what I call the border country between theology and psychology. And as a quick aside, if you've ever found a podcast episode of mine from a few years ago on a show called The Shot Put, this will sound very familiar, but hopefully so. If so, you're up for a bit of a refresher after a few years. I'm counting on it. So why a channel again where we deal with the issue of both theology and psychology? Someone just asked me that today. This episode is a crack at the question, why again, Brian, are you combining religious concerns and psychological concerns in one YouTube channel? And the metaphor for this channel, the metaphor is that of a border country. This is a channel that travels into a kind of border country between Christian theology and psychology, between spiritually oriented counseling and secular psychotherapy, between even biblical studies sometimes and studies as far-reaching as the central nervous system. It is a rich border country between those topics, meaning that it is fertile, it is verdant, it is a place where ideas can be exchanged, where learning from one another can happen. But I admit it's also thorny in places. Landmines have been reported in other places. And some of the territory is very much disputed by one or more parties. Now, if you leave the border territory and you retreat far into either country, either the country of theology or the country of psychology, as I'll put it, and just kind of bear with me on this extended metaphor. If you move into either of those two countries, you will meet some people in those lands who don't really know anything about the other country. Or they even believe that the citizens of those other countries are naive or even malicious. Some of the natives, for example, of Psychology-land, we'll put it, believe that Theology-land is sort of antiquated. It's a superstitious old kingdom that we'd all be wise just to evolve away from and leave behind. Christianity has nothing much to say, or really nothing at all to say about mental health in this view. And in fact, Christianity is probably the cause of a lot of mental dysfunction and suffering over the years. Sigmund Freud's famous phrase comes to mind at this point, where he says that religious belief is what he said was the universal neurosis, which he hoped that his emerging psychoanalysis model would help to cure people of. Not certainly to learn from or collaborate with in any way at all. But on the other hand, let's admit, some of the natives of Theology-land believe that the psychology folks over there represent an upstart, anti-supernatural, godless wasteland of sorts. God gives us, in this view, thank you very much, all that we need for every mental and human problem directly from Scripture, so that any use of modern scientific psychology has the result of making us more delusionally self-sufficient, more God-avoidant, and therefore more spiritually compromised. So it's dangerous. Those battle lines, I'm afraid, are very old, so it's no small thing to advocate for a border country in the way that I'm trying to do in this channel and elsewhere. If you're willing, though, let me just push this metaphor of border country a little bit farther. You might even say that most of us are unavoidably citizens of one of these two countries. One or the other, but not of both. And that's unavoidable and maybe even just proper to have your primary citizenship in one of these two lands. But the point is that we can still travel to the borderland with the other country in order to mix with those other citizens, mix with them, learn from them, maybe debate them, but whatever we're doing, to be humble and to be inquisitive the whole time. And that is very much the spirit of this channel, I hope. Humility and the spirit of being inquisitive to learn and fill in the gaps of knowledge that we haven't filled in yet. Now, some citizens of either country would say that the picture I'm painting here is far too rosy. It is a little too much kumbaya for their tastes, and it's just not realistic. Some of you, and I do want to respect this, might even have stories from your own life that are fairly painful that show the thornier patches of where the Christian faith and psychology have bumped into each other. And I really do get that. In fact, let me just tell you one of my own stories. Several years ago, my family and I were living very briefly in Sacramento. And I was at one point getting ready to interview at a social service agency for a job that was mostly about counseling homeless people. It was a clinical internship, actually. And at that point, I was on the path to licensure as a psychotherapist in California. And so the interview was set up, and I went downtown, and I went into this stark office building, and I came to the director's office and was welcomed and seated. And there she was, the director of the clinic, behind a big desk. And on the other side of her was a stool where a man who I think was an associate director of some kind was seated. And the director at one point looked down at my resume and said, "Oh, I see, Brian, that you've also been a pastor and a seminary lecturer. And so what I'm wondering is, with all of that religious background, would it be hard for you to not talk about God to your therapy clients? Would it be hard for you not to talk about God?" And I said, and look, I was born yesterday. I said, no, not necessarily. Clients have many needs, not just spiritual needs. And yes, a lot of therapeutic good can be done in people's lives without a constant, direct conversation about God. Now, at this point, I thought that I might be getting near some of the landmines in what I now call the border country. But on the other hand, I didn't really need the job, so I don't know if it was wise, but I told her a few more of my thoughts on the topic and in trying to answer her question. And I said, however, if a client of mine did decide to bring up God in a session with me, I assume that my pastoral background would at least give me the flexibility to join them in that kind of a conversation. And because in therapy, I believe that people sometimes really will bring up God or a variety of religious topics that are weighing on them. And sometimes those conversations with a counselor can be very helpful to them. And then I said, just to cover myself, I said, of course, I'd only go there. I'd only go into that religious direction if a client brought it up first and really led me into that. Now, let me stop the story there and just ask you this question. What's your guess? How did that answer of mine play to her in that very secular county clinical setting? I could tell that the clinical director was probably a citizen of Psychology-land, to put it that way, and that she was right to identify me based on my resume as primarily a citizen of Theology-land. But were we, and this was the question on my mind in that moment, were we in one of those safe and even exciting areas of the border country where sometimes citizens of either land can meet and share ideas, learn techniques from each other, even theories from one another, and even practice counseling alongside of each other, even if we don't necessarily agree about everything? Or I guess the alternative was, had I, very far from all of those ideals, just stepped on a landmine? Now, she might even think that God and Christianity are a fiction, and I wouldn't expect her to share the same religious convictions that I did, but in her mind, is it possible that the fiction that is Christianity could be, at the very least, a mentally healing fiction for some people? Or is it just an unhelpful fiction all the way down? Does religion poison everything, as Christopher Hitchens said, in her view? I suppose that some of you as listeners might even be thinking, hey, if you're a Christian, why would you even want to work in that setting in the first place? Since in the best case scenario, your hands might be tied behind your back, or at least one of your hands. But remember, I was trying to be a learner there. Anyway, what is your guess? What's your guess as to the outcome? Here's how it played out. She said, pretty abruptly actually, well, no. Religious conversations are not psychotherapy. If clients want to talk about God, you'd have to refer them out to a pastor or something. Okay, and so at that point I thought, well, she's not a fan of the border country, I guess. But then something interesting happened. The associate director, who'd been quiet until that moment, sat up and opened his mouth and said, very respectfully, very tentatively, I think, to his boss, well, Dr. So-and-so, a client's religious identity is part of their cultural identity. And some might even argue that there may be good reasons to follow clients into their religious concerns, even in psychotherapy. Now, from that moment, I probably could have, for the next 20 minutes or so, gone out for donuts by myself because nobody was really paying attention to me at that point. They really dove in themselves to their own wrangling about the nature of psychotherapy in a county mental health setting and whether or not it was appropriate to have religious dialogue of any kind. By the way, they did not offer me the job. I guess they sort of offered it to me, but then they said that their funding had just last week dried up or something, but they really said we should stay in touch. Anyway, no bridges were at least burned that day, I thought. And it was mostly a learning experience for me to get a sample of the debate that is active within the therapeutic community in a secular setting. What's interesting, and what I didn't know then, was that various ethical codes within the realm of licensed psychotherapy require now that you are, in fact, if you're a therapist, willing to wade into religious waters with clients who want to go there. All to say, the point of this channel, this YouTube channel, is to explore the border country. You know, that day, could I have learned something? Could I have learned something from that No God Talk Aloud clinical director? I'm absolutely sure of it. I could have learned a lot. She outdistanced me in many arenas in the therapy profession at that time, and probably still would. I would have learned a ton. Could she have learned by being open to the way that spiritual concerns, maybe even theological concerns, like the will of God, like what is our eternal destiny, like how do I deal with my cosmic sense of guilt, and is there a way to be forgiven, and what is the structure of meaning in my life, and how can I find it? That these sometimes are questions that can't be separated so neatly, these religious questions, from other mental health concerns. I'm pretty sure she could have learned something too. There are things for everyone to learn in the border country. There are people you can meet, even if you don't agree with what they say or even almost anything that they say. There are still between us goods to be shared, I'm convinced. Another way to talk about this is the idea of what has been called the two books theory of knowledge. The two books theory of knowledge. And that will get us back into theology land big time. If you're gangbusters to read a little bit ahead here, check out an old theological masterpiece from the 1500s called the Belgic Confession. We'll get more into the Belgic Confession and the two theories of knowledge. It's a very deep Christian theological category. We'll get back to that soon in another episode. In the meantime, thank you so much again for joining me.